Hey, this is Tom Hulkenborg. Many people might also know me as Junkie XL. Right now, I am a Hollywood movie composer and still a music lover, and also a big nerd when it comes to sounds, especially musical ones. In these next several episodes of this video magazine, I'm going to show you how and why I am creating this sample library.
Hey guys, you absolutely sound fantastic.
So that anybody can create an even better film score, a piece of music, or simply just having fun playing with it. Are you ready? Let's do it. Does anybody really need another brass library? Yes, absolutely. And let me try to explain to you why. But for that, I want to tell you a little bit more about my past.
So how did I get into music? Well, it wasn't really a choice. I was brought up in a family where everybody played instruments. My dad was a really talented mouth harmonic player. My mom played violin, she played piano, and she was also a teacher. She taught music theory to kids that were very young. So from the basic moment, I got really into music and I really got into education. And these two things will become very important to me for the rest of my life. So I started playing all kinds of instruments. We would make music together with the family. And my first instrument was the piano. Until my parents discovered that instead of me drumming on the piano, it would probably be better to just give me a drum kit. And that's what they did when I was 7. I got a drum kit, and now I could actually play the drum kit. And I still didn't lose the interest of the piano. I was still playing piano. And now I actually learned how to play the piano instead of banging it. But at the same time, I played the drums and I had so much fun in playing the drums. So I would say drums is really my first instrument. When I went to high school, I really got into electric bass and I really got into electric guitar. But the life-changing element for me really happened when I did two things at the same time. One, I became an assistant engineer at a local studio. I was like 14, 15 at the time. And I learned how to record with microphones. And in the beginning, I was just making coffee and cleaning up the studio, what you have to do when you start as an assistant. And later, I was actually able to record things myself. And then by the time I was 17, 18, I turned into a producer. And I actually produced a lot of local bands. And then I started to produce a lot of international bands as well. Now, the other thing that happened at the same time is I was starting to work at a music store, a very small local music store that sold a bunch of guitars and drum kits, bass guitars, some amplifiers, and they had 2 synthesizers. And those were particularly out of interest for me. So I asked him, it's like, so why do you only have 2 synthesizers? And he said, well, you know, we're living on a countryside. People don't really understand synthesizers. And they don't really understand what you can do with them. And there's this thing called MIDI. I don't even know what it is, but apparently you can do all this really cool stuff with it. And I said, oh, I'm very interested in that. Do you mind if I take more of a role in that? And he said, yeah, absolutely, go for it. On one hand, I was an engineer and I was producing bands. And on the other side, I was now working with these synthesizers and the early computers that came out where you could sequence music. And MIDI at the time, for people that are not familiar with that term, was the first digital communication method that was there for digital machines to talk to one another. And we're talking very early days here, 1984, 1985. And this is also where a very interesting style of music started happening in the 80s, whether it was the early hip-hop, whether it was the early dance, whether it was the pop music. Everybody now started integrating things that were organic with things that were derived electronically, and the production level of a recording became very important. I started bringing all these things that I've learned in the shop into recording, and I brought all the things that I was learning as an engineer back into the shop. And what I found out is that from that point on, a couple of things were important for the rest of my career, still till today. And that is a few. A, my music consists out of real played instruments, like a guitar, like strings, like brass, like woodwinds, like a choir. But it's always combined with things that are derived electronically. Synthesizers, weird sound design, drum computers, samples that were being made. So what became very important from that point on is sound. Like, how good does it sound, and what can I do with these two elements, the ones that are programmed and the ones that are actually played live. So let's flash back to 1985 when the Roland S50 came out. This was a beast of a machine. I still have one. It was roughly this big. It was, I think, 6 octaves. And basically what you could do in that sampler, mind you, you had 15 seconds in total that you could sample. Yes, I'm quiet. 15 seconds. In the world nowadays of PCs, Mac laptops, contacts, whatever sample library out there, 15 seconds is a joke. 15 seconds is maybe one note, one articulation, one little blip. In those days, 15 seconds was all you had. So if you wanted to create a sample library, you had to divide these 15 seconds up into slices of a half a second, which would give you, 15 seconds and a half seconds, 30 samples to play around with. Now, a little later in the early 90s to half 90s, a couple of companies now started developing libraries for these early samplers, like strings, brass, woodwinds, drum kits. And as these samplers progressed and they got more and more memory, these libraries became more important. So now we're in the year 95, 96. And this is the year where I did my first record as the artist, Junkie XL. Junkie XL's music has always been 50% derived from these type of samplers and then added organic elements to it that I explained earlier. It would be vocals, it would be live bass, it would be live drums, but also analog synths. And analog synths is another fascination that I have. In the first days of Junkie XL, I was able to combine these analog synths with real basses, real guitar, real drums, with things that I made with these samplers. I have a really, really great recollection of that whole time period, touring and just doing all these gigs and making songs. And now something happened in 1998. I go to the cinema and I see a movie. And in one of the scenes of that movie, they actually used a track that I released on my first artist record. And the track was called Dealing with the Roster. And it was used in the movie Blade with Wesley Snipes, the first Blade. And I'm just like, man, isn't it amazing how my piece of music works to picture? And that was the first time. It really sparked something in my mind. It's like, I want that. I really want that. And eventually it led to me moving to Los Angeles in 2003. I came there and I thought, the world is going to be my oyster. The moment I knock on the door of Warner Brothers and say, hey, Tom is here, that immediately they would swing open the door and they said, Tom, we got 6 Batman movies here ready for you to score. Pick any movie, you can start tomorrow. Doesn't quite happen like that. But there was one thing that stood out for me immediately, and that was I needed a sound voice in this industry. And when I say that word, I mean it the following. I wanted to make sure that when my first movie score came out, it was produced, it was mixed a certain way, and it used sound a certain way that would be unmistakably me. Not somebody else, me. So I started building sample libraries, all kinds of libraries, myself, that were easy to do. A guitar library, a bass library. Then later, it got a little bit more comprehensive. Drum libraries. Then I started experimenting with small orchestral libraries, something that I could do on my own. Now finally, I have a composing career, and I am doing all these movies, but I'm still using a few libraries out there that are commercially available to everybody. And I have a certain discomfort with a few of those to actually use in my own film score. And that's why we've gotten to the point to do my own brass library. Why a brass library, you would ask? A brass library for me is very important in my movie scores, from the super soft to the super blatantly loud. And brass, for me, is the one of which I feel commercially a library is missing that I really, really want to use. The thing that I've chosen for is the basic instruments, but to do them really, really right. And we're going to spend a lot of time recording all these sessions to get all these details really, really right. What I want you to feel when you open up this sample library and you play your first line is you want to make music like straight away. Like the first two lines that you play accidentally happen to be, you know, the major theme of a movie that's coming out in 10 years from now or 5 years from now. That's how inspired you should be when you play this instrument. You load it up, you go to preset 1, and instantly you feel the biggest, best, most inspired composer on the planet.
So a long story short, a plan was formed. But obviously this is not a one-man job. How could I ever possibly do this all on my own? So I went out and find the right people to create this with me, and I found them.
Did that microphone come down, or is it supposed to be at the same height?
The first time we met Tom was because we wanted to create a YouTube series with different composers.
Make sure I have enough room on the cable.
We ended up with this idea in mind to create a brass library that is really next generation.
We're in the room right now, and everything looks absolutely fantastic. Hey there! We're finally at the studio where we will be recording the brass library. I want to thank you so much for all the comments that you have given us, the great tips. There were some really good tips actually that we're actually going to use in this library that we will be recording here. So stay tuned. If you have more comments, just leave them below.